Who was Jane Addams? Jane Addams was a notable figure in the social work profession. She is recognized as the founder of the social work profession in America. Jane Addams was born on September 6, 1860 in Centerville, Illinois. She was the youngest of 9 children. Her parents are John Huey and Sarah Weber Adams. She is, of course, a woman. She grew up very wealthy. Her dad was in the Civil War. He had a successful mill, a politician. He even was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. She was your average English American woman. Her family traces back to colonial Pennsylvania. She grew up Christian, but she states her ideas was not of religion but a pattern belief. Since she was young, she wanted to help the poor and become a doctor. What influenced her was her mother, who was a very kind woman before she passed away due to childbirth. She went to Rockford University, Illinois. She inherited $50,000 from her father, who passed away. She went on to medical school using that money, but due to her back injuries, she dropped out. So at age 26, she started to read magazines such as My Religion by Tolstoy and Subjection of Woman by Jon Stewart, which made her question the social pressures on a woman to marry and devote her life to family. Reading these also inspired her to visit the world's first settlement house, Tonby Hall in London. So at age 28, she went on to London to visit the settlement with her friend Ellen Starr. This settlement inspired her to bring the idea to America. Her and her friend later on decided to start their own version of Settlement House to focus on social reform. At age 29, her and her friend did that and called it the Hull House.
Jane Addams was known as one of the most distinguished females of the first generation of women who went to college. She went against all social norms by rejecting marriage, motherhood, and putting social reform above all. In 1889, Jane Addams, with her college friend, Ellen Starr, moved into an old mansion in an immigrant neighborhood in Chicago. It was later called Hull House. Hull House was a progressive social settlement aimed at reducing poverty by providing social services and education to working-class immigrants and laborers. It was also Addams' home for the remainder of her life, a perfect place to experiment for social science research and a model for settlement work for individuals in poverty. Addams responded to the needs of the community by establishing a nursery, kindergarten, dispensary, playground, and cooperative housing for young working women. Hull House also welcomed males and females who were dedicated to social reform. By 1900, Hull House expanded with a library, gym, pool, labor museum, theater, and a meeting space for labor unions. Addams and other Hull House residents sponsored legislation of child labor to establish juvenile courts, labor unions, limit the hours of working women, make school attendance mandatory, and ensure safe working conditions in factories. The Progressive Party adopted many of these improvements as a part of their foundation in 1912. Addams also heavily advocated for women's suffrage. She published a book called 20 Years at Hull House in 1910. She elaborated that society should respect the values and traditions of immigrants and help them adjust to American institutions. She believed in addressing the problems of urban life and industrial capitalism. Addams was not in favor of World War I because she believed it encouraged political repression and only benefited munition manufacturers. She tried to convince President Woodrow Wilson to call a meeting to mediate the end of the warfare, but it was unsuccessful. Throughout the war, Addams advocated to increase food production to aid those who were starving in Europe. After the end of the war, she helped establish the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She served as president until her death in 1935. In 1931, after her long involvement in the war and international changes, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Jane Addams had a passionate commitment to the pursuit of justice. Addams clearly understood the relationship between fundamental causes and the conditions people lived in. She worked tirelessly to address the causes rather than passively observing and commenting on the need for social changes. Addams was an active role in the creation of the social work program and advocate for peace and equality.
Jane Addams was one of the first people to truly define what it meant to be a social worker and what social welfare programs can do for people. She was a social worker before the profession even existed. She devoted her entire life to helping the people who needed it the most, especially women and children. In addition to establishing Hull House, which offered daycare, employment services, libraries, art galleries, English classes, and many other services, Jane Addams helped found the National Child Labor Committee to protect the rights of children, specifically in the workplace. Children were often forced to work long hours in unsafe and unregulated working conditions with very low pay, if any. Adams sought to help child workers and succeeded in creating a committee that would fight for their rights. Jane Addams even worked as the assistant to President Herbert Hoover in providing relief to women and children in enemy nations. Her efforts truly reached across the entire nation and still have a great effect to this day. The definition of a social worker is essentially modeled after Jane Addams and what she accomplished in her life. And almost 100 years later, social workers still use her as a role model and an example of what social workers can do.
Looking closely into oppression and marginalization, women could not vote in the early 1900s. Women were oppressed, not as much as people of color were, because that was a different struggle, but they were oppressed. Women couldn't even have jobs. They would stay home, cook, clean, and tend to children. Women could not even get an education. There was a point where women weren't even counted in the census. They were shut out of any political activity. They couldn't even vote. Analyzing power and privilege in the progressive era, there was an imbalance. White males predominantly had all the power and privilege. White males had the right to vote, buy, and own houses. They got to exist as human beings. Women couldn't hold seats in office. White men had all the power and privilege. To combat this, Adams assembled a group of very committed young women. They became the female face of the democratization movement. She advocated for peace and women's rights. She drew attention to social and racial tensions. She reported on the effects of different ethnicities and their living conditions. She talked about labor circumstances in sweatshops. She even talked about child labor that resulted in child deaths. She created a platform that issues of human struggles with racism, poverty, illness, disabilities, and oppressions could be analyzed. She created a platform that back and forth conversation could be held to analyze micro and macro levels and discuss oppression. The 6 core values of the social work profession are service, social justice, dignity and worth of the individual, importance and centrality of human relationships, integrity, and competence. Jane Addams incorporated that throughout her practice. With service, she used her connections and selflessly helped further the advance of equality for women. With social justice, she openly advocated for the oppressed and against most forms of social injustice. Dignity and worth of the individual. She realized that women were worthy because they were humans too who literally deserved rights. She understood the importance and centrality of human relationships with women. She understood that women were important. Women are literally the birth givers in society. They birth our children. She made it clear that allowing women to have a voice was critical for change. In terms of integrity, she had no other motives besides advancing equality for women. She was very confident in the fact that she as well was a woman and understood what it was to be a woman. She understood what it was like to not have a voice in society and not have society recognize your worth. She understood the values of being a woman. I'm going to leave you with an amazing quote by our social work mother, Jane Addams. The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life.